Interspecific interactions are those that occur between members of different species, as opposed to intraspecific, which is between members of the same species. A lot of these would also apply to intraspecific relationships, but we're going to focus primarily on interactions between members of different species. Competition is a situation that is referred to as a minus-minus relationship, meaning that both organisms are going to be negatively affected by that relationship, by the competition. And it is, of course, the fight for resources, things like food, shelter, territory mates, things such as that. And again, this can apply to intraspecific relationships as well as interspecific, but again, focusing on that interspecific aspect. So there's a principle known as the competitive exclusion principle. And basically what that says is that two species cannot occupy the same niche because one would outcompete the other. One would have some type of advantage that would give them a better opportunity, a better chance of competing for that particular resource, and so one will win and one will lose. The loser either has to move to a different area or will die. So they cannot occupy the same niche. And so we'll see that there are some ways that species can avoid this type of competition within the same ecosystem. So one of the ways that species can avoid competition is through what's known as resource partitioning, which basically just says that they occupy different niches within the same ecosystem. And an ecological niche refers to how and which biotic and abiotic resources organisms use and kind of their role in the ecosystem. So as long as they serve a different role, a different place, a different position in the food web, whatever it is, as long as they have their own specific job within that ecosystem, then they can coexist. So in this picture, we see several different species of lizards, very similar lizards, that feed in different locations within the ecosystem. Some will perch on the fence, some at the bottom of the tree, some at the top of the tree, but by feeding in different places, they're able to coexist. When we look at organisms' niches, what we find is that sometimes the actual niche that they occupy is very different from what they are capable of occupying or would occupy if not competing with something else. So in this experiment, these scientists were studying barnacles that were located on these rocks. And what you see is these brown barnacles tend to live above the blue barnacles, but when they removed the blue barnacles experimentally, they found that the brown barnacle would fill the space that had previously been occupied by the blue one. And so what that means is the brown barnacle's fundamental niche was much larger than its realized niche. So the fundamental niche is the one that it can occupy, and the realized niche is the one that it actually does occupy when in competition. Predation is one that we're all pretty familiar with at this point. So of course it's where a predator kills and eats a prey, and it is a plus-minus relationship, and again, that's pretty obvious. The predator, it's a positive relationship for it, and the prey, not so much. So essentially both predators and prey have adaptations that give them opportunities, in the case of the predators, to catch their prey, and for the prey to avoid being caught. So we will look at some of those different adaptations. Predators will often have adaptations related to catching the prey, so sharp claws, a sharp beak, a pointy beak, various different physiological adaptations. For the prey, their adaptations will often be trying to avoid being seen to begin with, or making themselves appear unappetizing or dangerous. So this idea of defensive coloration is that trying to avoid being seen or caught. So there's several different types. We have cryptic coloration, where they try and blend in with their environment. We would also call that camouflage. So up here we have the canyon tree frog, which is very difficult to see in that picture because he blends in very well. The stick bugs would be another example of cryptic coloration. They look like sticks rather than bugs, so they aren't seen as food. Then you have the aposematic or warning coloration, like the poison dart frog here, which basically tells the predator, hey, you don't want to eat me because you might die. So there's that. Then you have two that are kind of hard to keep straight. We have Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species resembles a harmful one, basically trying to trick the predator into believing that it is harmful. So we have the hawk moth larva here that is actually just basically a worm, but because of the way it has these spots that look like eyes and the shape of its head, it very much resembles this green parrot snake, which is not what the predator is going to want to eat. So that is Batesian mimicry. And then Mullerian mimicry is one where two unpalatable or two harmful species resemble each other. So you have a cuckoo bee and a yellow jacket. They both have the black and yellow striping, which is essentially telling predators, hey, you don't want to eat us. We either don't taste good or we might hurt you. Herbivory is a situation where an organism eats parts of a plant or alga. And again, this is a plus-minus relationship. The herbivore is receiving the benefit while the plant or algae not so much. So as with other situations that we've talked about, the herbivores will have adaptations that help them to eat the plant or the algae, and then the plant or the algae will sometimes have defense mechanisms to avoid being eaten. So in the case of the herbivore, they may have the ability to detoxify any chemicals that are produced by the plants, or sometimes they can sniff out whether or not it is a nutritious plant, something that's worth their time to eat, and just the ability to identify edible plants versus non-edible. And then plants have defense mechanisms such as the ability to produce toxins, and then also physical structures like spines or thorns that are going to discourage herbivores. Next, we're going to look at symbiosis, which is the relationship between two or more species that live in direct contact with each other. And this type of relationship may be harmful, helpful, or neutral to one or more of the parties in the relationship. So the first one we're going to look at here is parasitism, and we're fairly familiar with that one at this point. So that is where one species, the parasite, obtains nutrients from another organism, the host, which is harmed. So this is a plus-minus relationship where the parasite, of course, benefits from the relationship while the host is harmed in some way. So there's a couple of different types of parasites depending on where they live. Endoparasites, endo refers to inner, so these would be found inside the host, like tapeworms. Whereas ectoparasites, ecto means outer, so these would be found on the surface of the host, something like fleas on the dog, like we see here. So parasites, the challenge with them is that they do affect organisms and their populations because they can sometimes limit the reproductive abilities of the organism because they weaken them, and nobody's going to reproduce with a weak organism. And so that would affect them indirectly. But then you have situations where they may transmit diseases or something that could harm the host. But usually parasites aren't going to kill their host because they need them. They need the resources that they're obtaining from the host. And if they kill them, then they have to find a new host. So typically when we see something dying from a parasitic infection, it's because there are too many of them or because they have transmitted some disease from the parasite to the host. Mutualism is a relationship in which both species benefit. It's a mutual relationship. So this is a plus-plus situation. So we can classify mutualistic relationships based on how important they are to the members involved. So an obligate mutualistic relationship is one in which at least one member of the relationship is very dependent on the other and really cannot survive without the other. And this is a situation with lichens. If you remember, a lichen is a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and either an algae or a blue-green bacteria. And that is one that has become so closely connected that scientists have actually considered classifying a lichen as a distinct species, even though it's technically made up of two different species. On the other hand, you have facultative mutualism, and that is one where both species can live without the other, but they do like the benefit that they receive from each other. So in that situation, we would have this alligator and bird in the picture here, where the bird gets food and the alligator gets its teeth cleaned. And so both benefit from it, but neither is completely dependent on the other. The final example of symbiosis is commensalism, and this is one that scientists don't always agree upon. But basically it's described as a situation where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. It's a +0 relationship. So the classic example is the orchid in the rainforest. So in the rainforest you have the canopy, the top of the rainforest there, where the trees block a majority of the sunlight from reaching the forest floor. So the problem is, for smaller plants like orchids, they don't get any sunlight. Well, orchids are viney plants, so they're able to climb the trunk of the tree and poke their leaves out above the canopy so they can get sunlight for photosynthesis. Some scientists would argue that this does even very slightly harm the tree because the orchid is stealing sunlight from the tree. But other scientists would say, no, yes, they might be taking sunlight that the tree might use, but the tree's getting what it needs regardless. So there's no true harm being done. Another example is the water buffalo and the egrets, the cattle egrets that we have here in this picture. And what happens here is the water buffalo, as they're eating the grass, kind of flush out insects that the cattle egrets will then eat. So, the egrets get food and nothing really happens to the water buffalo. They're neither helped nor harmed. Again, some scientists would argue that the water buffalo do get the benefit of having these annoying insects being eaten by the egrets. Our last topic today is ecological succession, which is the series of changes that occurs in a community over time. Now, we're not talking about the normal slight changes that happen on a day-to-day basis. We're talking about major changes that occur in a particular ecosystem. There are two types of succession. The first one that we'll talk about is called primary succession, and this is going to occur in an area where no life previously existed. So places like a new volcanic island that forms, or when a glacier recedes from land and bare rock is exposed. And the key feature to primary succession is that there is no soil when it begins. So it takes a long time because in the beginning here, you have to break down the rock and create soil, and that takes a long time. So typically you're going to have things like lichens and mosses moving in first because they don't require soil. But as they grow and as they live on the rock, they actually break down the rock and start adding nutrients to it. And when you break down rock and add nutrients to it, you get soil. Once you have soil, then you can start getting some simple grasses in, some small shrubs, and then ultimately trees. And depending on the particular environment where this ecosystem is located, the final community may be different if it's a grassland or a tropical rainforest or whatever, depending on that particular area. So then secondary succession is going to occur in an area where there was life and something happens and the majority of the dominant plant species is removed. So a forest fire, a volcanic eruption that does not have lava flow, a tornado, anything that's going to wipe out a majority of the plant life and therefore the animals that live in that area. So the key factor here, the key difference between primary and secondary succession is with secondary succession, you still have soil. So it can occur much more quickly because there's not that time requirement for breaking down the rock to make the soil. The soil's already there. So as soon as the event is over and things have cleared, then the grasses start coming in, then the shrubs, and then the trees. So it's the same sequence, but much quicker. Mount St. Helens is a great example of secondary succession. This picture shows the volcano before it erupted in 1980, and there's a slideshow that you can access by clicking on this picture, and it will show kind of and talk about how secondary succession occurred in the Mount St. Helens area after the eruption. So click on the picture, and when the website loads, select Launch Interactive, and it will start the slideshow.